Thank you for everybody who's logged in tonight. My name is Brittany Grono. I'm super excited to be here. I do apologize for the little bit of a rough start, but I'm looking forward to kind of diving in. So this is part of our wellness series, and today we're going to be focusing on the art of self-love and how to foster a relationship with yourself. So let's dive in. Just so you guys know, if you haven't been with us before for these monthly webinars, we hold them every month. A different clinician here at the practice presents and kind of shares their thoughts and feelings on a certain topic that we feel like is going to be beneficial for the community. Oftentimes, they're on topics that the individual counselor focuses on directly or tends to lean into with working with their clients. And so this is our opportunity to kind of share what we do and what we love with the community. So again, I'm excited to kind of have you guys here and share a little bit about what I enjoy working with clients with. Okay. My name is Brittany Grono. I am an LPC associate. My supervisor is Deanna Capabera Stewart. She is a supervisor clinician here in the practice. A little bit about me as a clinician. So I am a fairly new clinician. I am in my pre-licensing phase, and I got official back over the summer. How I work with clients is I tend to take a person-centered approach while also using different coping skills. So I use a lot of dialectical behavioral therapy to help clients kind of manage emotional dysregulation, distress tolerance, increase mindfulness, and improve interpersonal relationships. I tend to pull in other modalities as well. It's important to me that my clients feel heard and that we're working on things that really work for them. So I'm big on meeting my clients where they're at. Part of what I love to bring into the session is authenticity, both for my client and both for myself, so that it's a safe space for everybody who kind of comes in, which is why the topic about self-love is really important to me, because I think when we're able to really love ourselves, we're able to be our authentic self. So I'm excited to kind of share this with y'all. So some of the things we're going to focus on today, some of our objectives are we're really going to focus on how do we build a relationship with ourselves, right? So we're going to focus on strategies to help build self-awareness, increase self-compassion, learn how to lean into self-acceptance, and then understanding boundaries and how we implement it. And then lastly, we're gonna kind of put it all into practice and how we can kind of implement it on a daily basis. So before we dive into strategies, we should first talk about what is self-love, right? We probably hear it all over Instagram, and social media about, oh, love yourself, right? But we don't really get a lot of substance beyond that. And so self-love is a state of appreciation for oneself that grows from actions that support our physical, psychological, and spiritual growth, right? So self-love means having high regard for your own well-being and happiness. It also means taking care of your own needs and not sacrificing your well-being to please others. Self-love is about when self-love is kind of a journey, and when we're able to kind of practice it, we're able to move towards healthier relationships, healthier version of ourselves, and healthier mental health. And so it really kind of impacts all areas of our life. Okay. So, some of the benefits to self-love. Scientific evidence suggests that having self-love has a positive impact on our mental health, our sense of self-esteem, and our overall life satisfaction. The benefits include increased self-esteem, improved interpersonal relationships, resiliency towards anxiety and depression and other mental illnesses. It can also help us kind of create more assertiveness. And assertiveness isn't aggression, right? So it isn't harsh. Think of it as more firm, right? And so it's understanding, but it's firm. And so that's where those boundaries can kind of come in. It helps with better emotional regulation, pursuit of personal goals and interests. It can increase motivation, as well as help create some of those healthier boundaries. So let's look at the barriers to self-love, right? So what makes accessing this part of ourself so challenging, right? And then on the flip side of that, how does not having self-love impact us on a daily basis, right? So some of the barriers that kind of make accessing self-love a little bit more challenging is societal messaging, right? We hear a lot about how to have healthy relationships with others, and we aren't often taught how to have a healthy relationship with ourselves. We're often taught that, when we care about ourselves, when we prioritize our needs, it can come across as selfish. And that can kind of make people feel a little scared, right? I mean, I don't think anybody wants to come across as selfish. And so that messaging can often lead us to sacrifice our own needs based on some of these societal messaging, right? If you struggle with perfectionism, right, it can be hard to have compassion and care for ourselves when we're constantly trying to meet high expectations or unrealistic goals. And we are highly critical of ourselves and challenge ourselves, right? Self-sacrificing behavior. This also includes people pleasing, right? This is the concept of when we constantly are putting the needs of others over our own. We tend to neglect kind of what our body, our mind, and our spirit kind of needs in those moments, right? Fear of judgment, right? How are people going to react if I start prioritizing myself, if I start caring for myself? Are people going to view me differently? How is this going to impact me? And I think that that's fair, right? Internalized negativity. Sometimes our inner thoughts can be quite harsh, right? And there's always that saying, we are our own worst critic. And so some of that kind of plays in here, right? So when we maybe want to branch out and reach into self-love and self-care and kind of start having that relationship with ourselves, maybe we have some negativity that kind of pops into our head that tells us that we shouldn't, right? There can also be a lot of shame. Maybe there's feelings that we don't deserve to care for ourselves and take care of ourselves. Maybe there's guilt. Maybe there's parts of ourselves that we haven't quite yet forgiven, and it's a roadblock that's preventing us from kind of getting there, right? Some of the negative impacts that not implementing that self-care and that self-love towards ourselves, not having that relationship with ourselves, can mean that self-criticism, right? Increased negativity and self-criticism, more people-pleasing tendencies. We may tend to tolerate mistreatment from others, right? We may tolerate our needs not being met because of, again, those feelings of shame or internalized negativity kind of come into play. We can also disregard our own needs, right? That people pleasing, that self-sacrificing. I think if you've kind of compared the two lists, they're kind of intertwined. And I think that that makes a lot of sense, right? It can be a cycle that we can get stuck in. Some of the barriers that prevent us from accessing this healthier part of ourselves also contributed to the negative impacts and vice versa, right? So what we're going to really focus on today is how do we break through those barriers? How do we help kind of get out of this cycle so that we can start having a healthier relationship with ourselves? So now we're going to dive into the strategies a little bit. All right. So building self-awareness, right? I think that, again, a lot of these are going to be concepts that we've probably heard floating around, but I want to really dive into the meat of it. So you have some genuine action steps to take towards kind of building this healthier relationship with yourself, right? So self-awareness is the ability to recognize and understand our own thoughts, emotions, behaviors, right? And so one of the first steps that we can take is self-reflection. So self-reflection, I want you to think about it as spending time with yourself. So just like we would in any other relationship, right? Let's say, think of a good friend or a family member or a loved one, right? Think about the time that you spend with that person. Think about how the connection builds the more quality time and deeper connection you have with that person. right? The more vulnerability that's shared. We want to look at self-reflection in the same sense when we're building that healthier relationship with ourselves. And so self-reflection, it can look like journaling. It can look like checking in with yourself, but it's really about setting aside intentional time to be with yourself, to ask yourself those hard questions. What am I noticing right now? What's coming up for me? What are my needs? And how do I show up for myself? The way that I would show up for others, how can I then turn that back and implement that for myself? And it can be challenging at first. So, a really great way that I think I normally use with clients to help them start building that self-awareness and start learning how to check in with this self is I love to pull in this DBT mindfulness skill of these what and how skills, specifically the ones that are how do we observe and describe without judgment, right? And how do we participate fully in this experience, right? So this can be like a body scan or a check-in. Although I can't see everybody, if you would like to participate, I'm going to walk you guys through a quick exercise. So I want you guys to kind of get comfortable, kind of relax a little bit. And if you can close your eyes and kind of lean into it, I encourage you to do so, but it's not mandatory. And what I want you to do is, without judgment, kind of think about it as a little bit of a scientific or detective. I want you to just look inwards and see what we notice. So start with physical sensations. As you scan your body, what sensations are coming up for you? Sometimes when we're anxious, our heart can race. What is your heart doing in this moment? How are you noticing it? What is the temperature that you notice? And as we are kind of moving forward without judgment, it can look like I've noticed coldness in my fingertips, or I notice my heart is elevated. I notice my foot is asleep, right? It can be whatever you tend to notice. It could be whether there's tightness in the chest or pain in our lower backs, right? I want you to kind of look and see what sensations come up for you in this moment. After we kind of notice those sensations, we're going to look at what kind of emotions are showing up for ourselves right now, right? How do we label it? If there's anger, what's underneath the anger? Is there frustration? Do we feel unheard? Are we feeling misunderstood? Do we feel like we've been wronged? What's underneath that anger? And then what is the need that's kind of beyond that, right? And so instead of saying, oh, I shouldn't feel angry or I shouldn't feel this, without judgment looks like I'm noticing that anger is coming up for me right now. Another way, if you like to be a little bit more playful, it can be like, hey, anger, I notice you're showing up for me right now. Whatever is more comfortable for you on how you want to notice what's going on in your body, I always recommend taking that route. Thoughts can be a little bit tricky, right? Thoughts are where the criticism kind of roll in. And so when we're scanning our body and we want to notice our thoughts without judgment, that looks like, oof, I notice that criticism is kind of showing up right now. Or it's the thought of disappointment just crossed my mind. Or the thought about what all the things I need to do for work is definitely surfacing in my head right now. And when I think about it, I notice my heart elevates and the feeling of anxiety kind of comes up. It sounds super simple, but when we can start labeling what's going on internally, we start to build an awareness around our environment and around ourselves that can help us move us forward to the next step. Sometimes it's the simplest steps that help us move forward and reach our goals. The next is curiosity. Ask yourself questions, right? You know, ask yourselves, what is the need that's coming up for me right now? Why is this emotion here? What is this emotion trying to communicate to me? I think one of the best benefits or the best antidote to criticism is curiosity. When we notice that critical part coming up, asking yourself some questions. The thought, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. Why do I feel that way? Why am I thinking that? Where is this coming from? And meeting it with that curiosity can lean you into those deeper understandings and those deeper questions. The last is mindfulness, right? I think that this is a big part. Everything that we just talked about essentially is mindfulness. But what I want to talk about mindfulness is I think we have a lot of generalizations about what it is. We often think that it's yoga and meditation and, and sound baths and all of those things are mindfulness and so important. But mindfulness is so much more than that. As someone who tends to work with teens and people who are more neurodivergent, mindfulness can be a really big barrier that we kind of face together. And so, how I approach mindfulness can be fun, right? It can be challenging. It's anything that helps you stay present in the moment and focus all your energy into one thing. So this can look like crafting, creating, singing, dancing, right? Doing something artistic. It can also look like playing a game, right? I think the best example of this is think of a scavenger hunt. If you're really into the scavenger hunt, you're probably not thinking about a whole bunch else, and you're probably able to access the present moment a lot easier. And so if you're really stuck on mindfulness because it feels like a chore, I want to encourage you, how do we pull it out of that chore mindset and into something a little bit more fun? Next, we're going to look at self-compassion. So self-compassion is the practice of understanding and kindness towards oneself, right? And I think what the barrier that I've tend to run into with compassion when I talk to other people is people are always like, have self-compassion, just be kind to yourself. And without any other support to help you actually do it, right? So beyond just have it, I haven't heard a lot of people explain how to have it. So I really wanted to do my due diligence to try and help you find some skills so that you can really implement self-compassion beyond just, having it. So the first and one that I think is so important is self-validation. And I think that there's a lot of misconceptions around validation and what it really means. So validation doesn't always necessarily mean agreement, right? So we can validate our emotions without validating an experience. So for instance, if we've made a mistake, we're probably having some thoughts that come up that are kind of like, oh, I can't believe I did that. I shouldn't have done that. Oh my gosh, right? And so some feelings of guilt, embarrassment, remorse might be coming up, right? We can validate that we feel guilt, that we feel remorse without invalidating the experience or validating the mistake, right? There's a balance between the two. So we can say, I understand. It makes sense to me that I'm feeling guilty and embarrassed. And I understand that I made a mistake and can move forward from it, right? So it's not, I think a lot of people get confused where if we validate our emotions, then we're validating behaviors that we don't want to validate. And that's not true. When we have self-compassion, when we have that validation for our emotional state and for who we are, we can then move forward from a different perspective. Um, and so self-validation is hard and it can take a lot of practice. One of my favorite things that kind of lean in to help with self-validation is dialectical thinking. So dialectical thinking is one of my favorite DBT skills. I think it's so universal and so practical. So dialectical thoughts and dialectical thinking comes from the basis that two opposing things can be true at the same time. And so what this does is it kind of challenges some of this all or nothing thought processes, right? So it's, that all or nothing kind of looks like pass or fail. It's this or that. Um, it can be thoughts of I'm either good or I'm not, right? I'm either capable or I'm a failure, right? Those really hard, polarizing criticisms that can feel so impactful when they kind of pop it up into our head. And so dialectics is moving away from either or thinking and moving into both and. It's also going to be implementing like sometimes. So sometimes I am capable and sometimes I make mistakes, right? That statement is rooted in validation and understanding, as well as in that area of the gray. It's more flexible thinking instead of rigid, right? So dialectics can be also, for instance, you know, I work really hard and I also need to try harder sometimes, right? It can be, um, I'm trying to think of a good other example, right? So it can also be sometimes I feel good and sometimes I don't, you know? I can love someone and still feel hurt by their actions sometimes, right? I can love myself and still have hard days. Some days I can be productive and others I'm not so productive, right? So it's kind of finding that in between, right? The truth between two polar opposites. The next is challenging our inner critic, right? Again, our sometimes our worst enemy is our inner critic. And so I wanted to go over some thinking patterns that are pretty common. So three that I really want to focus on is all or nothing thinking, or black and white thinking, disqualifying the positives, and shoulds. Those are ones that I often see come up the most when we're talking about self-esteem. So the first one, all or nothing thinking, we kind of went into it a little bit with dialectics, right? And so again, it's finding the gray. So instead of it's this or that, how can we either combine the two to find the truth, or is there a middle ground that we can kind of settle on? The next one is should statements. I think this one gets people all the time. I should have done this. I should do that. Um, Hindsight is always 2020. And so it can be so easy to slip down the road of shoulds. And so one really great little fix for that is instead of using the word should, interchange it with could. I could have been more productive today, and I chose to rest, right? Or I could have been productive and my body needed rest, right? And so if we're feeling like we shouldn't have done something, I shouldn't have done that, I could have done that, or I couldn't have done that. And but this is what I did do. And this is how I'll move forward with that decision. Even if it doesn't completely change the thought, just switching it to could helps decrease the criticism and kind of increases the compassion, even just a little bit. The last one is um, disqualifying the positives. And so it can be so easy that to focus on the negatives, right? The negatives feel threatening, right? It feels sometimes like the most important thing. However, if we only look at the negatives and we don't take time to acknowledge all the things that went right, then we're only seeing half the picture. And so disqualifying the positives can look like if you had a review at work and most of your feedback was positive, but you had one comment that was kind of or pretty negative, focusing all your energy on the negative and coming up with thoughts of, I'm a bad employee because of this one bad mark, even though the rest of the review was pretty positive. And so, again, when we're stuck in the negatives, challenging ourselves and being like, okay, this is pretty bad. This is pretty negative. What are all the things that are more positive, right? What are the things that are going right? And how do I balance out this picture a little bit? Next is building self-acceptance. I think this is one of those really challenging ones, right? Because this is the one where we have to face the parts of ourselves that we're not always comfortable with, right? So self-acceptance isn't just accepting the versions of ourselves that we do like, it's also accepting the parts of ourselves that we don't like, right? It's coming to terms, it's understanding our own abilities and our limitations, right? It's acknowledging them, it's coming to terms with them, and it's appreciating them for what they are. And I think that can be really hard, especially if we're struggling with perfectionism. Coming to terms with those parts of us that are imperfect can be really challenging, right? So we're going to go through on some ways that we can kind of help lean into self-acceptance a little bit more. One of those, and I'm sure one that you guys have heard so many times, is gratitude, right? I don't know a therapist who doesn't preach gratitude a little bit, right? It's always like create a gratitude list, journal about gratitude. It's all over social media and self-help books. And so I don't want this to be kind of a cheesy, generic thing, but I do want to stress kind of the importance with gratitude. At this point, it probably, you hear the word gratitude and you want to roll your eyes, and I totally get it, right? But I want you to think of gratitude as not a short-term goal, but a long-term goal, right? Saying we're grateful for something overnight isn't going to change anything, right? We're not going to wake up and feel accepted with ourselves, right? But gratitude over 3 months, 6 months, a year of consistency, there starts to be a shift in how we think about things and how we start to see the world around us. And that is the impact of gratitude that, again, I don't think is often stressed. And so, how you approach gratitude is totally your own way of doing it. Some people journal, some people have reminders. Um, but how you want to practice gratitude is up to you. Do you want to check in with yourself and say, hey, what am I grateful for in this moment? Do you want to journal or list it out? It's fully up to your creative discretion on how you want to practice gratitude. And even on those moments where it feels like, ugh, redundant, right? I want to encourage you to still kind of push forward through it, because the work is happening even if it's on kind of that microscopic level, right? The next one, and I think again, this is another big challenging one, is decreasing those comparisons, right? This can be so hard, especially when we live in a world where everything feels like a comparison, right? Especially if you're pretty active on social media, and the implementation of AI and Photoshop and all these things, it can be so easy to compare. It can be so easy to compare our life when we are only seeing a part of another person's life that looks so much better, right? But unfortunately, the effects of comparison are pretty heavy, right? It can make us feel inadequate, can decrease our self-esteem. It can kind of contribute to mental illnesses like anxiety and depression. And so even though we often use comparison to motivate ourselves, right? The cost that it has on our mental health is so heavy for what we're trying to use it for, right? And so it can be hard to compare. When we find ourselves needing to compare, right? I want to challenge you. How do you compare to yourself, right? How have you grown, right? Where are you now? How have you gone through things that were hard, and how did you survive that? How did you manage it, right? If you can survive that, you can survive whatever you're going through in this moment, right? And so when we're stuck in those comparisons, kind of pulling it back towards ourselves can help. Although even that can kind of be a slippery slope sometimes, right? And so what I really want to encourage is, how do we focus on what is going right? So instead of comparing all the things that we don't have, right? This is where we lean into that gratitude a little bit. How do we notice everything that we do have? How do we lean into our strengths? How do we lean into our values, right? Do we have a, you know, a journal, a vision board, um, a photo album where things that bring us joy kind of hang out, right? One of my favorite things to do, as I was growing up, was anytime I got a note from a teacher, a peer, a loved one, I would put it in a box. And anytime I was really struggling with how I felt about myself, I would go into my box and I would read all of the kind things that people have left for me. And I think I still do have some of those boxes. And I think in college, I used to put them on a board, right? And so, how do we collect things? If we can't remind ourselves, right? How do we utilize the love that's been shared by other people in moments where we're feeling like we don't have a whole lot of love for ourselves, right? How can we lean on those other relationships so that we can help ourselves build a relationship with ourselves? The next one I think is such a beautiful concept, and really dives into the concepts of embracing imperfection. And so there is this Japanese art form, aesthetics concept of wabi-sabi, and it talks about the beauty and imperfection. And so what it is just like in nature, nothing in nature is perfect, and yet nature is inherently beautiful. It's peaceful, it's calm, it's healing, right? And it's also natural, right? We're human. We're not designed to be perfect. And therefore, noticing the things that make us unique, that make us different, that are some of those imperfections, are also the things that make us human and beautiful and natural and are a part of who we are. And I think fits so beautifully into this concept. Um, a good example that kind of led me to lean into this a little bit more was I have a background in art. And so, um, I've always been in these art circles, and there were some fiber artists who found it challenging that in their work, because fiber art, clothes and fabrics are so mass produced, they're so perfect, right? That fiber artists have now perfectly implemented imperfections into their work so that people know that their work was hand done, and that people can value the work that went into it instead of comparing it to something manufactured. And I think that that is a really great way of looking at it. When we're looking at social media and we're seeing the AI and the Photoshop, right? That's manufactured, right? There is something so inherently beautiful about being who you are in the moment outside of trying to fit this manufactured mold. Um, and again, bracing imperfections is not easy, and it's going to take time and practice. And with that, I always want to remind people that we always want to strive for progress over perfection. 20% better is 20% better, right? It's better than 10%, right? And so, what are ways that you slowly notice yourself moving forward that help you lean into progress when we're feeling stuck in the lack of reaching those expectations that we had? The last one is forgiveness. I think that this is another one. I think, again, anything with self-acceptance, I think is challenging, right? Because it makes us face those parts of ourselves that we don't feel comfortable doing. And so forgiveness is powerful, right? We often talk about forgiving others, but we don't often talk about how we forgive ourselves, right? And so we all have had experiences that we may have regretted or feel embarrassed about or have guilt towards, right? But when we can take that moment and forgive ourselves of those moments, right? We're opening our heart up for something else, right? And so, just like the impact of forgiveness towards others is apparent, when we implement it with ourselves, it's just as apparent. And it can again help with increased positive mental health, how we view ourselves in a more positive light, and decrease our feelings of anxiety around other things. Lastly, we're going to talk about building boundaries, right? Another concept that I think is thrown around about having boundaries, but we often don't talk about what boundaries are, or what it looks like to have a healthy boundary or a rigid boundary or a porous boundary. We're kind of just told boundaries and we're not really given a whole lot of information on that. So I wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit more to hopefully give you a little bit more insight so that you can work on kind of creating those boundaries for yourself in a way that works for you. So boundaries are the physical, emotional, and relational limits that define what is and what is not acceptable for you, right? And so understanding our emotions and identifying our needs are kind of the first steps on even creating boundaries in the first place, right? If we don't know what our needs are, how are we going to create a boundary around it? And our emotions are our greatest insight into what our needs actually are. Emotions, I think emotions are often seen as this big, overwhelming thing that we can't control. But emotions in essence, are the way our mind and our body and our spirit kind of communicate with each other, right? And spirit can also be intertwined with like self-consciousness, right? So our emotions are communicating to us. So, for instance, if we're angry, right, and we ask ourselves, what's underneath this anger? Are we, again, feeling misunderstood? Are we feeling wronged? If we're feeling sadness, right, what do we need behind that sadness? Are we feeling lonely? Are we feeling, um, you know, kind of hard on ourselves? Are we feeling lost or stuck or disappointed? And then we can ask ourselves, what do I need? If we're sad and we're feeling lonely, how do we seek comfort? How do we seek company, right? If we're angry and we feel misunderstood, how do we create reassurance and understanding? Is that something we need to kind of dig in for ourselves, or is that something that we need to kind of get externally, right? Um, Next is understanding the difference between boundaries, right? We talk about boundaries, and sometimes we go from too loose to too rigid, and we kind of go on a pendulum. And so I kind of really want to define what's the difference between rigid, loose, and healthy boundaries, right? So in essence, rigid boundaries tends to keep people out. Think of it as, um, like a wall to a castle, right? The gates are locked and no one is coming in, right? So it is very closed off. It does not leave a lot of room for vulnerability, connection, and intimacy, right? On the flip side, loose boundaries or porous boundaries is kind of the opposite. It's where we kind of get too involved or intermingled into other people's stuff, right? We're oversharing, right? We're giving too much of ourselves and we're kind of intertwining our needs with the needs of others, or we're neglecting our needs. Um, and so it's kind of, if we talked about polarizations, it's two sides of the coin, it's two ends of the spectrum. Healthy boundaries are in the middle, right? That's where that assertiveness is. It's firm and soft. It's how do I protect myself and my needs while also still being open for connection, vulnerability, and intimacy. It's where those healthy boundaries, and those healthy relationships and connections start to take place. And the benefit as why this is important for the relationship with yourself is, think about it. If you wouldn't want someone to hurt your loved one, if you have boundaries for the people that you care about, how do you have boundaries for yourself so that parts of you don't get hurt, right? I think there's also understanding the risks to boundaries that I really want to go over and make sure that everybody's aware of, is that when we start implementing boundaries, it can be a shock for people who are used to us having rigid or loose boundaries. It can be like a farmer who's only ever sold strawberries. And upon learning that if he doesn't rotate his crops, the field and the soil will lose its nutrients and he won't be able to grow anything. And so when the farmer goes to market with not strawberries, but carrots and lettuce, some of the customers are pretty upset because they're used to always having strawberries. And, but if the farmer gives in and only does strawberry, then eventually no one will have strawberries and the fields will die and his livelihood and the comfort of others would kind of go downhill, right? And so it may take time and the customers may be unhappy, but with time, customers will still get their strawberries while also still rotating out other foods and nutrients. And so it's kind of a little bit of a metaphor, simile for kind of what boundaries can look like and why people have a hard time accepting them, right? Something that they're used to having and are comfortable with has now changed. And change can be hard, whether it's within ourselves or we're experiencing it from others. And so it can take time for things to settle and for people to kind of adjust and get re-comfortable with the boundaries that you put in place. And I want to let you know that because I don't want it to be something that scares you away from practicing boundaries. Um, I think a good step is go slow. start implementing smaller boundaries at a time to kind of test the water, right? We're not gonna, cannonball into freezing cold lake or freezing cold pool, but when we take one step at a time, we slowly start to warm up to the pool, right? Um, Again, a part of this is practice and patience. None of this, none of the self-love, the acceptance, the compassion, the boundaries, none of that is going to happen overnight. And so it does take consistency and practice. It's also not going to be linear and it's not going to be perfect. And that's kind of part of the journey of it, right? But if you set intention, if you want to be deliberate about it, if you really want to build this relationship with yourself, take a moment and think about what that would look like, right? What happens when we do meet barriers? What happens when we do meet roadblocks? Or we lean into our criticism a little bit more, right? And we're not being so self-compassionate. And so all of that is part of this journey, right? And every opportunity, every roadblock, every barrier is a moment and an opportunity for growth. It's a way that we can change and develop and get a better understanding of who we are and what our needs are. And so they shouldn't be things that scare us, but things that encourage us and open us up for some new opportunities. And so those are some of the strategies towards building self-love, right? Lastly, before we kind of dive into questions a little bit, I want to share an exercise that I've often used with some of my own clients that is a little bit more fun and a little more experimental. And everybody has their own thoughts and feelings towards it, which is totally fair. It's not necessarily a new concept. And I have had clients that have seen some success with it. But I want to encourage you guys to see what it would look like to date yourself, right? So it can be a little uncomfortable or silly or odd to think about it in that way. And you're probably like, what on earth do you mean, Brittany? How on earth would I even date myself? And I think that that's fair. And that is definitely a question that has definitely come up. And so I want you to think about it just like you would in any other relationship, right? Friendship, romantic relationship, right? You spend time with the person. You do things for the person. You get dressed up for yourself or for others, right? Those same principles we apply back onto ourselves, right? So it's how do you plan time with yourself? Are you going to go on a little date, do a movie date, or take a walk in the park? If you love flowers, you know, do you buy yourself flowers? Do you have hobbies that we haven't been doing because there's so many other responsibilities, right? How do we take time to do some of the things that we enjoy, right? How, if just like you would with a date with someone else, you schedule it out and you plan it in your planner, you do the same thing with yourself. Just like we would compliment a loved one, we look in the mirror and we compliment and we provide reassurance and affirmations to ourselves. When we're feeling down, getting dressed up and feeling good, getting a nice haircut, right? It talks about some of those self-care things, but self-care only goes so far when it's done outside of intention versus when it's done with intention, right? And so I loved this quote that said, "How you love yourself is how you teach others to love you." This is why the practice of dating yourself, and there's tons of articles on it, is important because when you take the time to spend with yourself, you start to understand what are your needs, what are your values, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are your red flags, what are your green flags. And when you understand these things about yourself, you start to notice it in other relationships and you start to realize what you're willing to tolerate and accept and what you're not. It's kind of the concept of if I can love myself like this, then I need someone else who can also love myself like this, right? And so it can be that beautiful thing. And again, I want to stress that self-love isn't selfish, right? It's understanding our needs and who we are while also being considerate and taking into account other people's needs and other people's thoughts and feelings, right? So it's balance between the two. It's balance between understanding yourself and understanding others. knowing and validating your own feelings while knowing and validating the feelings of others. That's what makes it not selfish. Um, and so, again, it's a bit of a, fun activity. It's a little bit out there. But whether you want to call it dating yourself or spending time with yourself or building a relationship with yourself, however you want to label it is totally up to you. But I do want to encourage you to the same amount of effort that you put towards the relationships that you have with other, how do you then double back and provide that same level of effort towards yourself? And so I do have some resources. If you want to screenshot this, you can, but I do believe we will also be uploading this on some various platforms. And so uh, one of the books I absolutely love, I love anything Brene Brown, and I think she does such a great job talking about shame and vulnerability. And so The Gifts of Imperfections is a great book, especially if you're struggling with perfectionism and have a hard time with self-acceptance. That can be a really great one. If we struggle with negative core beliefs of I'm not good enough or anything like that, the book on how to be enough can kind of help you work through there. And then the last one, radical acceptance. So again, another really great DBT skill is radical acceptance. Extremely hard to implement, but when you have the skill down, it is so effective. Hard to learn, but amazing once it's learned and implemented, right? And so these are some books that if you're interested, if you're an audiobooker or a reader and would like to kind of dive into this a little bit more, here's some recommendations. I loved this quote. You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserves your love and affection. And I think that that's true. The love we give for others, we deserve to give to ourselves, right? Some of the citations and where I pulled a lot of these resources from. So I promise I didn't just pull it all out of my head. So I went through and kind of pulled things from different places to provide the most effective information that I could for you guys. For more information, you can call or text us at Eddins. If you are interested in counseling, you can always sign up with a free 15-minute consultation with me or any of our other wonderful clinicians at our practice. Everybody specializes in different things. I don't think I mentioned before, but I tend to work with ADHD, depression, anxiety, life transitions, self-esteem, and I do practice from a trauma-informed and neurodivergent lens. And so if that's something that appeals to you, please, I would love for you to reach out. I do think I had my email listed. So if you have any questions, you can always email me. And I really appreciate everybody who joined and was part of this talk. There's my email if you want to go ahead and write it down if you have any questions, or if you'd like to schedule a consultation, I would love to hear from you. And I'm going to go ahead. I don't think that I have anything else. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. I do want to leave some time for questions, just in case anybody had any questions or thoughts that kind of came up during the presentation. But before we kind of dive into that, I did want to let you guys know I did create a handout for y'all. So I like to make things fun. Any opportunity I can make things fun, I'm going to make things fun. And so part of the handout, there's a self-love cheat sheet, which kind of just breaks down what we talked about today into little like paragraphs. So you have little reminders. Um, the next sheet is a self-love bingo card. Again, if we're stuck on ideas or we don't really know where to start, making it into a game is a great place to be. And so if you would like to kind of download the bingo card, I think we might have uploaded it into the chat. And whether you want to do a straight line, four corners, blackout, it's totally up to you. But it was just a fun way to try and make this a little bit more engaging for you guys as you put it into practice outside of here. And lastly, I added a self-reflection sheet so that when you're starting that journey of self-awareness and spending more time with yourself, you kind of have an outline to kind of go with to kind of get you started. All right. So I do think we have, I don't know if we have any questions, but if we do, you guys can go ahead and put them in. But other than that, I have thoroughly enjoyed sharing this information with you guys, and I hope you found the information today helpful.